I went to her house to fix a car door, but in that quiet garage, her eyes told me she was the one who needed fixing. I still remember the way the late summer heat softened as I stepped into the open garage that afternoon. Outside, cicadas hummed lazily in the warm air, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dipped just enough to feel like a quiet refuge. The smell of engine oil mixed with the faint scent of old cedar shelves. There was something strangely comforting about it, like a place where stories had been left to settle in the dust. I'd promised my girlfriend I'd stop by her family's house to look at the squeaky door hinge on their old sedan. I'm no professional mechanic, just a 24-year-old who likes to tinker with things, but I figured it would be a simple job. I didn't expect anyone else to be home. That's when she appeared, Elena, my girlfriend's older sister. I'd met her briefly at a family dinner months ago, but I hadn't really noticed her then the way I did now. She was in her early 40s, dressed casually in a loose linen shirt with the sleeves rolled halfway up, her dark hair pinned back, but with a few strands slipping loose to brush against her cheek. She moved with an unhurried steadiness, the kind of presence that makes you instinctively lower your voice, as if you've stepped into a quieter room. She greeted me with a smile that felt more like acknowledgement than politeness. "Car trouble again?" she asked, her tone light, but carrying a softness underneath it. I laughed, setting my small toolbox down by the car. "Just a noisy door hinge. Shouldn't take long." Elena crossed her arms loosely, leaning against the doorframe as if the garage were her favorite corner of the house. The afternoon sun slanted across her shoulder, catching the fine strands of hair that had slipped free. There was something grounded yet graceful in the way she stood there, like someone who had learned how to fill a space without needing to claim it. I bent to inspect the hinge, trying to focus on the task, but aware of her presence beside me. The garage was quiet except for the soft scrape of metal as I loosened the bolt and the faint rustle of her shifting against the frame. I noticed the small details, the citrus and spice scent of her hand lotion carried in by the breeze, the subtle warmth in her voice when she asked how my week had been. As I tugged at the stubborn hinge, she stepped closer, kneeling beside me to hold the door steady. Our arms brushed for the briefest moment, cotton sleeve against the rough fabric of my shirt, and that single touch lingered in my mind far longer than it should have. It wasn't charged or inappropriate, just unexpected, the sort of moment you'd normally forget but somehow can't. She tilted her head slightly, her voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "You fix things pretty well," she said, eyes still on the hinge. "Maybe better than most people fix each other." Her words caught me off guard. Teasing, but there was a flicker of something more serious behind them. I looked at her then, really looked, and noticed a shadow of weariness in her otherwise warm expression, as if she carried a weight that had nothing to do with cars. I didn't have an answer for her, so I just offered a small smile and went back to the hinge. But the garage no longer felt like a place where I'd come only to turn bolts. Something about that brief exchange, the warmth of her voice, the fleeting brush of her sleeve, stayed with me, quietly changing the air between us. By the time the first hinge was loosened, I realized that the story beginning in that garage had very little to do with the car at all. The late afternoon sun had begun to lean lower, stretching long shadows across the garage floor. The air grew cooler as the warmth seeped out of the concrete, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth from the garden outside. A single streak of gold light filtered through the side window, catching on floating specks of dust that drifted like slow snowflakes. I wiped my hands on an old rag, crouched beside the car door. The hinge creaked in protest each time I tested it, and I muttered something about stubborn bolts under my breath. Elena, who had been standing by the workbench, smiled as if she'd heard. "You know," she said, stepping closer, "that door's been squeaking for years. Maybe it just likes the attention." Her voice carried that quiet humor that never demanded a laugh, but somehow invited one. I glanced up at her, meeting her eyes briefly before dropping back to the wrench. "If that's the case," I replied, "I'm not sure whether to fix it or let it keep talking." Elena chuckled softly, then rolled up her sleeves another inch, revealing a faint tan line at her wrists. Without asking, she crouched down beside me to hold the door steady. The movement brought her close enough for me to notice the scent of orange blossom lotion on her skin, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the oily tang of the garage. As we worked in tandem, our conversation turned light. Stories about stubborn old cars, small mishaps in the kitchen, her memories of road trips when she was younger. I realized how easy it was to talk to her. Her laughter wasn't loud, just warm and unhurried, the kind that filled the quiet space more completely than noise ever could. At one point, as I reached behind me for the screwdriver, her hand moved at the same time. Our fingers brushed, barely a whisper of contact against the rough metal handle. It should have been nothing, just a passing accident, but I felt the warmth of her fingertips linger on my palm even after she withdrew her hand. She seemed to feel it too, a faint, almost imperceptible pause before she cleared her throat and shifted slightly back. The garage settled into a rhythm, the scrape of metal on metal, the faint hum of cicadas outside, the occasional clink of tools against the workbench. Each sound felt sharper in the quiet that stretched between our words. I found myself glancing at her more often than necessary, at the way a strand of hair had slipped loose from her clip, the way she brushed it aside with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint streak of grease near her temple without noticing. For a while, we didn't speak at all, yet the silence wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it carried an odd sense of companionship, as if we had known each other longer than a few scattered meetings at family dinners. There was a softness in that stillness, something unspoken but undeniably present. When I finally tightened the last bolt and tested the door again, the hinge moved more smoothly. Elena smiled in approval, a small dimple appearing near the corner of her mouth. "I guess teamwork pays off," she said, her tone light, but her gaze lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary. I busied myself wiping my hands again, hoping she didn't notice the way that glance had unsettled me. I reminded myself that she was my girlfriend's sister, that this was nothing more than two people sharing a task. But as we stood there side by side in the cooling light of the garage, I couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the air between us. The way a simple shared chore had left something unspoken hanging quietly in the space we shared. By the time we'd finished cleaning up the tools, the bright edges of daylight had already dulled to a silvery haze. The air carried that heavy stillness that always comes before rain. I stepped outside the garage to stretch, only to feel a cool drop land on my forearm. Then another. Within minutes a fine drizzle began to fall, soft as sifted flour. Elena moved to stand beside me at the open threshold, arms loosely folded, her gaze turned toward the driveway, where thin ripples formed in the shallow puddles near the tires. The scent of rain on warm concrete rose up around us, earthy, familiar, and strangely calming. For a while neither of us spoke. The rain pattered gently against the leaves, a quiet percussion filling the spaces our voices left empty. I felt the urge to say something, anything, to break the silence, but it seemed wrong to disturb it. Finally, Elena exhaled, her breath forming the faintest cloud in the cooling air. "Funny," she said softly, almost as though speaking to herself. "I used to love rainy days when I was younger. They made me feel reset. Lately it just reminds me of how fast time goes." I glanced at her. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a hint of wistfulness. The drizzle dampened a loose strand of her hair until it clung to her cheek. On instinct, I shifted slightly closer, not enough to be obvious, just enough so she wouldn't have to speak into the empty air. She went on, voice still low. "After Dad passed, I sort of became the one who held everything together. I thought if I just kept fixing things, bills, errands, everyone else's problems, maybe I wouldn't notice how much of myself I was putting away in boxes. Sometimes I feel like that old car, a fresh coat of paint on the outside, but the engine's been running too long without a tune-up." Her words caught me off guard. I'd expected polite small talk, maybe a passing joke about the stubborn car door, nothing this raw. For a moment, I couldn't think of what to say. I wasn't sure she needed advice. She just needed someone to listen. I shifted my weight, leaning lightly against the door frame so I could face her more fully. "I think most engines run longer than they're supposed to," I said quietly. "Doesn't mean they can't be brought back to life with the right care." She looked at me then, her expression softer, almost searching, as though trying to decide whether my words were simply polite or something more genuine. A drop of rain slid slowly from her hairline down to her temple. Before I realized what I was doing, I reached up and brushed it away with the edge of my thumb. The gesture was small, careful, gentle enough not to overstep, but intimate enough that the air between us shifted. I felt her lean ever so slightly into the touch before she stepped back, tucking the damp strand of hair behind her ear. "Thanks," she murmured, barely above the rain's patter. That single word carried more weight than I expected. It wasn't gratitude for drying a raindrop. It felt like gratitude for staying present in that moment, for not rushing her or changing the subject. The rain thickened, tapping against the metal roof of the garage, and for a while we stood side by side again, listening in companionable silence. The quiet felt different now, less like the absence of conversation and more like the pause that follows a shared secret. As the drizzle softened back into mist, I realized something had shifted between us. We hadn't spoken of anything overtly romantic, yet a small thread of trust had been woven there in the rain, fragile but undeniable, like the first faint scent of spring carried on a lingering winter breeze. By the time the rain stopped, the air had turned crisp and carried the faint sweetness of wet grass drifting in from the yard. We had left the car door propped open overnight to let the hinge dry, and the garage felt more like a quiet workshop than a place for repairs. I returned after dinner with a small flashlight in my pocket, determined to finish tightening the last bolts before morning. Elena was already there, sorting through a small box of spare parts on the workbench. The warm glow from a single hanging bulb pooled over her shoulders, leaving the rest of the garage in muted shadow. The scene felt almost like a painting. Her figure half-lit, the golden light glinting off a thin bracelet on her wrist as her fingers sifted through screws and washers. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked lightly as I set down my tools. She smiled without looking up. "I thought I'd keep you company. Besides, the sound of crickets is nicer than the TV." The soft rasp of crickets filled the air, mixing with the occasional drip of water from the eaves outside. I crouched by the car door, shining the flashlight so I could see the hinge. Elena stepped closer to hold the beam steady, her sleeve brushing my shoulder as she adjusted her grip. We worked quietly for a while, speaking only when necessary. At one point, a stubborn bolt refused to budge no matter how I turned the wrench. I muttered a frustrated sigh, and Elena chuckled, a low, warm sound that somehow made the garage feel smaller, more personal. "Here," she said, kneeling beside me. "You hold it in place. I'll try some persuasion." She reached across me, her arm grazing mine as she steadied the bolt. Her fingers were firm yet gentle, and for a moment we were shoulder to shoulder, our heads nearly touching under the low-hanging bulb. The warmth from her presence pressed lightly against my side, a quiet, human nearness that had nothing to do with romance, and yet felt undeniably intimate. "Don't laugh if I break it," she murmured with a small smile, her breath brushing close enough that I caught a trace of rain-washed lavender from her hair. The bolt finally gave way with a metallic click, sending us both into a short burst of relieved laughter that echoed off the concrete walls. The sound wasn't loud but felt like it belonged entirely to that small space in that moment. As the laughter faded, we realized how close we still were, her shoulder barely grazing my arm, her knee almost touching mine where we knelt side by side. There was a brief pause, a breath of stillness that seemed to last longer than it really did. Neither of us moved right away, as if breaking that nearness too soon might scatter the fragile sense of trust that had grown between us. Elena was the first to shift back, brushing her palms together as she stood. "Guess that's teamwork again," she said with a soft laugh, her tone light, but her eyes carrying something quieter, something I couldn't quite name. I stood too, careful to busy myself with packing away the tools so she wouldn't see the way my thoughts lingered on that shared stillness. The garage returned to its gentle hum. The crickets outside, the soft creak of the hanging bulb swaying slightly from a breeze that slipped in through the half-open door. Before leaving, Elena reached to switch off the light, then paused to glance at me over her shoulder. "Thanks for sticking with it," she said, her voice warm in the darkened space. Most people would have given up on that bolt. Her words seemed simple enough, but I felt there was more behind them. An appreciation not just for fixing a car, but for staying present in the long, quiet moments in between. I followed her out of the garage into the cool night air, the sense of that moment of near closeness lingering like the faint scent of lavender and rain that drifted from her hair. The next evening the air was cooler than the day before, the kind of autumn breeze that carried the smell of wet grass and distant wood smoke. We had finished the repairs on the car earlier than expected, yet neither of us seemed ready to say goodnight. Elena suggested we step out to the porch to rest a while. The garage door remained half open behind us, a soft rectangle of dim light spilling across the driveway. We sat side by side on the wooden porch steps, listening to the quiet hum of crickets and the faint drip of rainwater still trickling from the gutters. I remember the way the night felt wide and calm, as if the whole neighborhood had gone to sleep. The only light came from the small bulb above the garage and the distant glow of a street lamp down the road. It was enough to outline her profile in soft gold against the darkness. For a few minutes, we said nothing at all. Elena rubbed her palms together as if warming them, even though the air wasn't truly cold yet. I waited, sensing she had something on her mind, and I didn't want to rush her. "You know," she began after a long pause, her voice quieter than usual, "people always expect me to be the one who keeps things steady, at work, at home, with family. It's like the moment I turned 30, I became the reliable one." I glanced at her, noticing the way she kept her eyes fixed on the dark yard ahead, as though she was afraid to meet my gaze. "That doesn't sound easy," I said softly. "It's not terrible," she admitted with a faint smile. "But sometimes it feels like being responsible means I'm not allowed to want anything for myself anymore. I'm always the sister who gives advice, the one who steps in to help, but rarely the one who's asked how she's doing." There was a weight to her words that made me wish I could offer something more than sympathy. I thought about what she had said the day before in the rain, about feeling like an old car running on an engine that hadn't been tended to. "I think," I said slowly, "that even the strongest engines need someone to check under the hood once in a while. That doesn't make them any less strong." Her laugh came out soft and short, not mocking, more like she appreciated the clumsy metaphor. She turned her head to look at me then, her eyes warmer than her expression. "Thank you," she said, and as she spoke, she rested her hand lightly on my forearm. The touch wasn't lingering or suggestive. It felt like a gesture of gratitude, a way of saying she knew I was listening. Her fingers were cool from the night air, but the pressure was steady, almost grounding. I hesitated before speaking again, aware of the unspoken line we both were careful not to cross. "I don't want to say the wrong thing," I said quietly. "I know where I stand. I just don't want to ignore how you feel." Her expression softened further at that, and for a moment we simply sat in that shared honesty, two people recognizing a bond they couldn't name, unwilling to hurt anyone by stepping past it. The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of the wet grass from the yard and rustling the leaves overhead. Elena pulled her cardigan a little closer around her shoulders, but didn't move her hand from my arm until she finally rose to go inside. That night on the porch didn't end with declarations or promises. Instead, it left behind a calm understanding, the kind that comes when two people realize that boundaries, when honored, can hold just as much meaning as a confession. Morning arrived with a softness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had decided to slow down. A pale wash of sunlight filtered through the trees, scattering faint patches of gold across the driveway. The air still carried a chill from the night before, but the garage was filled with a gentle warmth that came not from temperature, but from the stillness of a new day. I came back to check the car one last time, expecting the garage to be empty. Instead, I found Elena already there, standing beside the sedan with a cloth in her hand, quietly polishing the chrome around the headlights. She wore a faded sweatshirt and jeans, her hair still damp from a recent shower, pulled loosely into a knot at the nape of her neck. A few strands had slipped free, catching the morning light in soft brown gold. "You're early," I said, setting my tools on the workbench. She looked up with a small smile. "Couldn't sleep much. Thought I'd give the car a bit of a shine. Figured it deserves it after all the attention it's had lately." There was something in her tone, light-hearted on the surface, but with an undercurrent of reflection, as if she wasn't really talking about the car. I crouched by the repaired hinge and opened the door slowly. It swung without a sound now, smooth and quiet, as if the squeak had never existed. I glanced at Elena, half smiling. "Good as new." She nodded, then leaned the cloth over her shoulder. "Sometimes you fix something small and realize it was never really about the thing you were fixing." The words settled in the air between us. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I focused on packing up the wrenches and oil can, giving her room to continue if she wanted to. After a pause, she did. "You know," she began, her voice quieter now. "These last few days, they reminded me I'm still worth a little care. Not just from other people," She glanced down at her hands, wiping them with the edge of the cloth. But from myself too. I didn't realize how long it had been since I let anyone help me with anything. I didn't even know how much I needed it. Her words carried a kind of vulnerability I hadn't often seen in her. It wasn't dramatic. It was understated and honest, as if she had simply let a locked door slide open a crack. I stood up slowly and moved closer, unsure of what to say that wouldn't sound clumsy. In the end, I just offered what felt right. You deserve that care. Everyone does. She looked up at me then, and for the first time since we'd met, her gaze wasn't guarded or distant. It was open, steady. Almost without thinking, she stepped forward and slipped her arms gently around my shoulders. The hug was slow and deliberate, more a gesture of gratitude than anything else. Her cheek rested lightly against my shoulder. I felt her breathing deepen, a soft exhale that carried a quiet sense of relief. For a few moments, neither of us moved. The garage was silent except for the faint hum of a morning breeze slipping through the half-open door. I noticed the scent of her shampoo, fresh and clean, with a hint of lavender, mingling with the faint tang of polished metal. When she stepped back, there was no awkwardness in her expression. Instead, there was a warmth that felt steadier than before, as if some unseen weight had shifted off her shoulders. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being kind, for just showing up." I nodded, unsure how to explain that I felt I'd received as much from the last few days as she had. That morning didn't feel like an ending. It felt more like the quiet closure of a chapter. The car sat gleaming under the soft daylight, the squeaky hinge now a memory. But it wasn't just the car that had been tended to. There was a sense that something fragile and overlooked in her had been restored too, not by fixing, but by being seen. The rain had moved on by evening, leaving the world outside washed clean. The sky held that soft, violet hue that appears only after a day of showers, and the last streaks of gold sunlight pooled across the kitchen windows. I could smell roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread drifting through the house as I stepped in. Elena was at the dining table, setting out plates with the easy grace of someone used to caring for others. The car we had labored over all week now sat in the driveway like a polished trophy, its quiet hinge almost a symbol of how far we'd come in such a short time. Dinner was a simple family meal. Her younger sister, my girlfriend, chatted about her day at work, unaware of the small undercurrent of understanding that now existed between Elena and me. There was laughter at the table, the kind that comes easily when people feel at home with each other. I stayed quiet more often than usual, letting the conversation wash over me, stealing the occasional glance at Elena across the table. It wasn't longing I felt in those glances, at least not in the way I might have expected. It was more a sense of respect, an unspoken acknowledgement of what we had shared in the garage and on the porch. Moments that had taught us something about vulnerability and kindness, rather than anything that needed to be confessed aloud. At one point, as Elena reached across to refill the water glasses, her fingers brushed against mine. The touch was brief and ordinary to anyone watching, but her eyes flicked up to meet mine for a heartbeat. That was all it took to communicate what words never could: gratitude, mutual understanding, and the promise to let the past few days remain something private and unspoken between us. After dinner, while the others cleared the dishes, I lingered near the doorway to the patio. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth from the garden. Elena joined me a few minutes later with a dish towel in her hands. "Quiet tonight," she said, her tone casual. "Feels like the house is taking a deep breath after the rain," I replied. We stood there in companionable silence, watching the sky deepen to indigo. I could sense there was something she wanted to say, but instead she gave a small, almost shy smile. "Thanks again for helping with the car," she said finally. "And for everything else. I think I'll remember these past few days for a long time." Her voice carried no regret, only warmth. I nodded and answered just as gently, "Me too." She gave a small laugh, almost under her breath, then turned back toward the kitchen to help her sister. As she passed by, her hand brushed lightly against mine, an absent, fleeting gesture that felt more like a silent thank you than anything else. That was the last time we spoke about the garage or the rain or the hug we had shared that morning. It didn't need to be revisited. We had found a place for those moments, neither denying them nor letting them disrupt the life waiting outside that quiet week. The car stood gleaming in the fading light, its silent hinge a testament to how even small repairs can leave behind something lasting. In the same way, the days I'd spent there left behind a gentler understanding. That connection doesn't always lead where you expect, but it can still leave you changed, steadier somehow. I drove home that night feeling lighter than I had in a long time. We had both gained something real, an unspoken respect, a fragile thread of friendship that felt honest and whole. The story that had begun with a squeaky car door and an offhand remark in a dusty garage ended not with confessions or regret, but with the quiet comfort of knowing that, sometimes, what needs fixing isn't broken at all, just waiting to be seen. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps more people discover these slow-burn romances. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories about unexpected connections and second chances. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. What was your favorite moment in this story? Leave a comment below. I read every one.